lectures at the Medieval Institute. My name is Thomas Berman, and I'm the director of the Medieval Institute. And before I introduce our speaker, I should say some thanks to our donor, Robert Conway, a Notre Dame alumnus of 1966, who's been a generous benefactor of the university, and particularly to the Medieval Institute itself, and whose gifts to the Medieval Institute allow us to do many of the events like this and allow us to underwrite the scholarship of faculty and graduate students, but in particular underwrite this lecture series that we've been doing for almost 2 decades now. Now, it's fortunate in this case, as it is in a number of these cases, that the lecture is giving 3 different lectures because there's so much to say about the lecture by way of introduction that we can kind of spread it out over 3 different introductions. And so my colleagues in philosophy and medieval studies, Therese Corey and Stephen Gersh, will be saying more about our speaker tomorrow in the next night's introductions. But I want to say a few things now. Peter Adamson, our speaker for the next 3 nights, is the first Notre Dame alumnus to be invited to give these lectures. Peter was a PhD graduate of the philosophy department in 2000. He was directed by Stephen Gersh, our emeritus colleague in medieval studies, studying with David Morrell as well during his time here. He received his undergraduate education at Williams College, receiving his degree in 1994. While he was here, he focused on Arabic Neoplatonic philosophy, and his dissertation work culminated in a series of publications related to early Arab philosophy, including the Arabic Plotinus, a philosophical study of the Theology of Aristotle, published in 2002, as well as a monographic study about Kindi, the great philosopher of the Arabs, in 2007, and also in a collaborative translation with Peter Corman of all of Kindi's works into English that appeared in 2012. But somewhere along the way, in particular about 2010, Peter launched off into a very interesting academic direction that I think is worth all of us thinking about. He began a long series of podcasts called The History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps. And that series of podcasts, which is now more than 400, is ongoing. Peter has been on campus here and at UC actually this last few days interviewing more people for these podcasts. And they have covered a vast range of the history of philosophy, going back to the pre-Socratics, including what we think of as the Greek and Latin philosophical tradition, but also a vast number of Arabic philosophical tradition moving out into India and currently into Africa. This set of podcasts, which I highly recommend to you, and all you have to do is type into your Google, your search engine, philosophy without any gaps, and you'll get right there. Includes just a fascinating range of both discussions by Peter himself, but also interviews with other scholars on key philosophers and philosophical issues. So you can listen to the podcast about, for example, the Maimonides controversy, but you can also listen to a podcast called Sarah Strumza on Maimonides, the great authority Sarah Strumza from the philosophy and intellectual work of Maimonides. That set of podcasts then led to a whole other scholarly venture, that is the publication of a multi-volume history of philosophy without gaps that has been coming out since 2014. Including most recently a history of philosophy without any gaps, philosophy in the Islamic world. Now, any of you who've looked at these volumes will know that they are beautifully written and often quite entertaining and manage to communicate the importance of philosophy, I think, in striking ways. And it happens that, and I don't mind admitting it, that I quoted a sentence from the book on Islamic philosophy recently in the thing I'm writing about the great Islamic sort of philosophical theologian Mullah Sadra, and specifically about Mullah Sadra's doctrine of tashkik al-wujud, it's called intensification, a doctrine that helps explain explains that existence comes in gradations or degrees. And after describing this beautifully, Peter says about this the following: thus does Sadra have his cake and eat it too, able to enjoy the sublime taste offered by the Sufis' doctrine of the unity of existence, without giving up Avicenna's fundamental contrast between divine necessary existence and created contingent existence. It's that kind of insight and that kind of ability to communicate that I'm sure we're going to welcome over the next 3 days as Peter Adamson gives a set of lectures collectively titled Don't Think for Yourself, Faith and Authority in Medieval Philosophy. Tonight's lecture being specifically titled Taqlīd, Authority and the Intellectual Elite in the Islamic World. Peter Adamson.
Okay, thank you very much for that very kind introduction. Thanks for the invitation to come back to my alma mater. Go Irish. And thanks obviously to all of you for coming. So as Tom just said, this first lecture is called Taqlīd, Authority and the Intellectual Elite in the Islamic World. I live in Europe, where people actually ride bicycles. And recently I was riding with my wife through Munich. We came to an intersection. Ahead of me, my wife slowed down, checking for oncoming cars, then went across. It suddenly struck me that it would be perfectly reasonable for me to follow her across the intersection without bothering to look whether it was safe. After all, my wife is reliable and has good judgment, both in general and when it comes to the rules of the road. Also, she doesn't need glasses, I do. I thought it would be okay. Whereas I am a frequently distracted philosopher, she's a normal person. So when it comes to this kind of thing, I tend to trust her more than I trust myself. And she'd hardly be crossing if there were a car coming, so why not ride straight across, trusting her implicitly as I do? I would quite literally be staking my life on the assumption that she made the right decision, but this was a bet that I realized I would quite happily make. Then I looked for traffic anyway, just to be on the safe side. But it got me to thinking about how we make decisions, how we form beliefs, and the fact that we often do so simply by accepting the judgment of other people whom we take to be authoritative. Actually, I'd been thinking about this for a while anyway, because this very issue lies at the heart of many of our political controversies. We're increasingly warned against taking our beliefs from sources that were previously considered authoritative. Yesterday's paper of record is today deemed fake news. Michael Gove, responding to economists' gloomy predictions of Britain's leaving the EU, ventured that people in this country have had enough of experts. Well-credentialed scientists with expertise in vaccinations or climate change are greeted with distrust. Part of the problem is that many political issues are so vast in their complexity and scope that they defy the ability of individual people to form beliefs in a way that seems responsible. How many of us understand enough about the atmosphere to have a reasonably informed personal opinion about climate change, never mind being in a position to critically evaluate what specialist climatologists have to say? On this and many other issues, we are apparently in the politically and epistemologically uncomfortable position of choosing whose opinions we should blindly accept. What I want to show in the lectures I'll be giving here this week is that we can learn something about blind acceptance and how to avoid it from a surprising source, namely medieval philosophy. Surprising because medieval philosophers have a reputation for forming their beliefs in the most uncritical of ways, bound as they were by authority, locked into inflexible worldviews by their theological commitments, and threatened with institutional sanction, or worse, if they dared to step out of line. In these lectures, I will be implicitly challenging such assumptions, but that's actually not so novel. No expert in the field would nowadays accept this description of the medieval mindset as slavish and merely imitative. My main point will be a different one, namely that medieval philosophers engaged in explicit and productive reflection on this very question of when and how one might responsibly form one's beliefs based on authority. I'm going to be covering quite a lot of territory, both chronologically and geographically, although it will certainly not be without any gaps. We'll be highlighting authors and texts from the end of late antiquity in the 5th century or so down to the time of the European Renaissance in the 15th and 16th centuries, with occasional forays even later than that. And I'm going to be looking at 3 distinct yet closely interconnected medieval cultures. Some of what I will say concerns Latin Christendom, which will be familiar terrain for many of you. But I'll also be talking about intellectuals in the Greek-speaking Byzantine Empire and the culture to which most of my own research has been directed, the Islamic world. We'll be meeting Christians there too, as well as Jews, but in this first lecture I will be focusing on a concept that has its original home within Islam itself, and more specifically, in methodological debates that raged between Muslim scholars of law and theology. Oh, I forgot to put the first slide up, so these are the three medieval traditions I'll be talking about. So these scholars of law and theology did us the favor of finding a single word to describe the phenomenon we are interested in. They called it Taqlīd. This word, Taqlīd, is often translated as imitation, uncritical acceptance of authority, or blind following. It comes from a verb meaning to gird. There's a word you don't use every day. To gird. Can you gird anything other than loins in contemporary English? I think not. It can also mean to hang something upon the neck. For example, a necklace placed on a sacrificial animal. Fairly early in the Islamic tradition of law, perhaps in Iraq around the end of the 8th century, it came to be used for reaching judgments on the basis of someone else's authority. Someone who practices taqlīd, in Arabic a muqallid, has not personally reflected as to whether the judgment in question can be grounded in the sources of Islamic law, namely the Quran and the Hadith, the collected reports about the sayings and deeds of the Prophet. Such reflection is called ijtihad, or effortful exertion. It relates to the well-known Arabic word jihad, which means effort or struggle. And someone who performs ijtihad is a mujtahid. This terminology was, as I say, first used in legal context, but it quickly became important for theologians too, who began to debate the question I've raised at the start of this lecture. Is it all right to form one's beliefs, notably one's religious beliefs, just by following apparently reliable authority, hence by engaging in taqlīd? Or do we have a responsibility to perform ijtihad? Or, as we might put it, should we really try to think for ourselves? I actually want to establish not just that medieval Muslim thinkers had useful insights about this question, but an even more surprising historical thesis. Some of you may already have been thinking, when I mentioned the typical prejudices about medieval thinkers, that these prejudices would not apply to at least a handful of philosophers from the Islamic world. These were figures I like to think of as the Aristotelian Avant-Garde. Men, and they were all men, but we'll get to women on Thursday. So men like Al-Farabi, Avicenna, whose real name was Ibn Sina, and Averroes, whose real name was Ibn Rushd, who thought that all important beliefs could be established by pure reason. They did accept the religious teachings of Islam, but emphasized that these teachings were ratified and ultimately explained by Aristotelian philosophy. For them, religion was really just a less technical presentation of fundamental philosophical truths in a form that could be appreciated by non-philosophers. With this, the Aristotelian avant-garde espoused a rationalism more radical than we find in practically any thinker of medieval Christendom, in either the Latin or Greek spheres. In Arabic, they were often referred to as the falasifa, from falsafa, which is of course just a loan word from Greek based on Greek philosophia. Some have exalted the falasifa, the Aristotelian avant-garde, as the only true philosophers in the Islamic world, and perhaps in any medieval culture, precisely on the grounds of their outright and unabashed rationalism. But ironically, or so I shall argue, the elitist rationalism of the falasifa was itself an inheritance from the Islamic legal and theological tradition. It was by transposing the legal and theological concepts of ijtihad and taqlīd to the context of Aristotelian philosophy that the falasifa were able to articulate their own self-conception as independent thinkers who followed reason wherever it might lead. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is what we call a thesis statement. Let us return then to the debate over taqlīd within Islamic law and theology. Perhaps the most important figure for the beginning of this debate is Shafi'i, the founding figure of one of the four major schools of Islamic law. Shafi'i is well known for his endorsement of rational methods in law, such as the use of analogy, qiyas, where the ruling in a clear case is transferred to an unclear case because the second case is relevantly similar to the first. For instance, and I'm going to use the example that people always use, if wine is explicitly forbidden, by analogy, whiskey is also forbidden because it is intoxicating just like wine. Ijtihad could include the use of analogical reasoning, but should not be identified with this or any particular rational method. Rather, it is the use of any such method to arrive at an independently derived legal opinion, rather than uncritically accepting the judgment of others, which of course is taqlīd. A Shafi'i himself does not always use the term taqlīd in a pejorative sense. It is good and proper to be a muqallid when it comes to following the Prophet and his companions. But he thought that any jurist worthy of the name should be willing and able to perform ijtihad, which he deemed necessary because earlier legal scholars had often disagreed or simply offered decisions without any accompanying basis at all. As Ahmad al-Shamsi has written, whatever reasoning prompted such earlier opinions was a black box and could not be a basis for further jurisprudence. Shafi'i's followers were even more forthright in their critique of taqlīd, which for them came to have an exclusively negative connotation. This forced them to explain how they could indeed be followers of a Shafi'i himself, a rather ironic project that calls to mind the scene in Monty Python's Life of Brian, in which Brian instructs his deluded followers, "You've got to think for yourselves, you're all individuals," at which point they all shout, "Yes, we are all individuals," and then a small voice from the back says, "I'm not." The Shafi'is dealt with the problem by either restating, and hence in effect personally endorsing their master's own legal reasoning to get around the black box problem, or improving on that reasoning by offering corrections to what a Shafi'i had said, or further evidence to support his findings. This set a rationalist standard for jurisprudential reasoning. A qualified jurist is one who can supply an evidential argument for each decision. In contrast to this, taqlīd was defined already in the early 10th century as qubul qawl bila hujja, accepting a position without evidence, or without a rationale, maybe. There's a famous debate among scholars of Islamic law as to how widely and for how long independent reasoning, or ijtihad, was practiced by jurists. It used to be a commonplace to say that relatively soon after the time of Shafi'i and other school founders, jurists simply stopped bothering with ijtihad and contented themselves with good old uncritical taqlīd. But a now classic article by Wael Halak argued that the so-called gate of ijtihad was never closed, and at least if this means that legal scholars at some point entirely withdrew from personal reflection. To the contrary, we find even later jurists saying, for instance, that it is not possible for there to be an age without a mujtahid. Simply as a practical matter, independent reflection was needed to deal with new questions, such as the permissibility of using coffee and tobacco, much discussed by jurists of the Ottoman Empire. It has, however, been argued that ijtihad was applied in exceptional cases by exceptional figures, and that most jurists since the Middle Ages restricted themselves to studying and following the tradition. The mujtahid would be a bold and even iconoclastic figure, one who effectively sought to play the role of a new founder, like a Shafi'i himself. In light of this, Sherman Jackson has more recently suggested that we simply think of taqlīd as a form of legal precedent, dropping more pejorative translations that have to do with blind obedience. And if it's translated as precedent, it doesn't sound nearly as bad, right? It sounds good. It sounds like stability. We don't need to wade into the historical debate over the frequency and historical lifespan of ijtihad. For our purposes, it's enough to note that in the Sunni traditions, it was common to recognize a hierarchy of more and less advanced legal scholars. At the top would be the pure mujtahid, who works out a legal reasoning for his decision based directly on revealed sources. At the bottom would be the pure muqallid. This is the jurist who simply memorizes previous decisions and reapplies them. The same status is occupied by ordinary people, often called al-awam, meaning the common people, and similar in force to the ancient Greek phrase hoi polloi. By the way, parenthetically, people do not say the hoi polloi. Please, hoi means the. Yes? Okay, thank you. Public service announcement over. So as that similarity to hoi polloi implies, we're dealing here with a straightforward epistemic elitism. The legal scholar who performs ijtihad has real knowledge, whereas the ordinary person or taqlīd-bound judge is doomed to ignorance or, more optimistically, mere opinion. The elitism stands even when we take into account that jurists recognized other levels in between the pure mujtahid and the muqallid. For instance, one might perform what was called ijtihad within a school, or affiliated ijtihad. that is, reasoning within the dictates and principles of one's chosen legal tradition. Another way to qualify slavish passivity of common believers was to allow a minimal form of ijtihad called following, ittiba', which simply means pressing jurists to confirm that they are basing their judgments in revelation and not personal judgment. So in other words, they tell you what to think and you say, you got that from the Quran, right? And they say yes, and you say, okay. So that's pretty light touch ijtihad. The Shi'i legal tradition, meanwhile, attacked the epistemic elitism of the mainstream Sunni schools for being, in a sense, not elitist enough. For the Shia, Islamic law cannot be properly applied without the guidance of the inspired imams, who descend from the family of the Prophet through his cousin and son-in-law Ali. What was for them unconstrained legal reasoning, as practiced by Ash-Shafi'i and other Sunni jurists, resulted in mere opinion, not knowledge. Yet, as Shi'i legal thought developed, it also made a place for ijtihad, of course within the guidelines laid down by the imams. So it is that we find Shi'i scholars too, contrasting the knowledgeable scholar from the typical believer, who may and indeed should engage in taqlīd. As one scholar put it, it is incumbent on the ordinary person to act by taqlīd if he is incapable of ijtihad. Scholars who engaged in rational Islamic theology, which is my wordy translation of the word kalam, were concerned with and often formally trained in Islamic law. So it's no surprise that these debates concerning the permissibility of taqlīd found their way into theological discussions. I don't have time today to tell this whole story any more than I've told the whole story of taqlīd in Islamic jurisprudence, but it can at least be mentioned that the early thinkers we usually group under the heading of Mu'tazilism generally took themselves to be carrying out a religious obligation to engage in speculative inquiry. This was the view of the leading thinkers of the Basra school among the Mu'tazilites, Al-Juba'i and Abu Hashim. It is reported of them that they said the following: whoever is capable of knowledge of God becomes an unbeliever if he does not apply knowledge to know God, regardless of whether he abandons knowledge to pursue imitation, that's taqlīd, doubt, conjecture, or ignorance. We know of a dispute between Abu Hashim and another Mu'tazilite, Abul Qasim al-Balkhi, known as al-Ka'bi. Unusually within this tradition, al-Ka'bi held that ordinary believers who engaged in taqlīd were doing just what they should. He distinguished between, on the one hand, an elite of theologians who had the capacity and therefore the obligation to pursue knowledge of God through speculative inquiry, and on the other hand, those who are morally obligated to apply taqlīd and conjecture. These are the lay people, al-awam, the slaves, and many women. This, of course, is simply the familiar elitism of the jurists applied to the subject matter of theology, with added sexism for color. The more demanding attitude of the Mu'tazilites, who wanted all believers to engage in what we might call an ijtihad of theological reflection, was taken up by the most famous critic of Mu'tazilism, al-Ash'ari. He and his followers, the Ash'arites, are sometimes thought of as being less rationalist than these other theologians, the Mu'tazilites. There is some reason for that because of such teachings as their divine command theory of ethics, which they oppose to the Mu'tazilite view that humans can work out their moral obligations through pure rational reflection. But on the subject of taqlīd, the Ash'arites are remarkably rationalist too. Already in al-Ash'ari himself, I think I skipped a slide there. Already in al-Ash'ari himself, we have the idea that the Quran contains clear proofs and arguments that establish God's existence and his omnipotence over all created things, and that prove the genuineness of Muhammad's prophecy and the obligation to follow his example. As Richard Frank has written, al-Ash'ari assumes that the reasoned arguments are probative and complete on the grounds of theoretical reason alone, for if they are not so, then the Prophet's claim to authority cannot be reasonably accepted. Taking up this approach, later Ash'arites cite the Quranic verse, "Most of them do not know the truth, so they turn away," as a command to avoid taqlīd. One theologian said that the verse shows that to accept taqlīd is wrong, and that one must carry out the proofs and demonstrations. They lack knowledge because they turn away from reasoning. Richard Frank has argued that in their strictures against taqlīd, the main concern of the Ash'arites was that believers should be free of uncertainty. A muqallid might not be an unbeliever, but is a believer in only a qualified sense, because their convictions might be overturned by doubts that occur to them or are put to them by skeptics. In the absence of secure proofs, they will inevitably be vulnerable to this eventuality. And Frank is clearly right about this. For instance, he cites a report concerning the Asharite theologian al-Isfaraini, who said that the commoners are of two types. One consists of people who are not wholly lacking in a kind of reasoning, even if it is imperfect in its expression and its grounding. Such people are truly believers and in the proper sense know. The second consists of people who are completely unenlightened in this respect and have no real knowledge. Rather, since they believe through Taqlīd, their belief lacks integrity, and not one of them is free of uncertainty and doubt. However, I suspect that the Ash'arites had a further concern, which is a specific case of what philosophers now call epistemic luck. Believers whose conviction, by the way, when I was writing this, I got to this part and I said, oh, I know what I can call this, epistemic luck. That's a really cool phrase. And then I Googled it, and it's like, oh, there's like a whole branch of epistemology. Oh, that sounds familiar now that I think about it. Oh, well. So this is not my, this is maybe my coinage, but not my original coinage. So epistemic luck. Believers whose convictions are formed by Taqlīd will only be right if they happen to follow reliable authority. And this will be the case only if they happen to follow authority that is, in fact, reliable. Thus, a report on another theologian, Abul Qasim al-Ansari, has him saying that those who lack knowledge have only belief founded on conjecture and opinion. If they are right in what they believe by an unreflected acquiescence to the truth. And if they fail to grasp the truth, they are in error and deviate from the truth. So basically, the right people got lucky, the wrong people got unlucky. We saw that the jurists qualified their legal elitism by distinguishing between levels of Taqlīd, with one or more middle positions between outright Taqlīd and fully independent ijtihad. The Ash'arites did much the same in the theological contexts. One of their foremost theologians, al-Juwayni, said that ordinary believers have knowledge in an extended sense if they have a sufficiently strong feeling of certainty in their faith. He worried that demanding full-blown rational inquiry from them is, as he said, imposing an obligation that cannot be fulfilled, so that they are required only to have correct belief. That is free from doubt and uncertainty, and they are not required to know. Not required to know, that is, in the strict and proper sense of the knowledge attained by an expert theologian, such as al-Juwayni himself. Another qualification that, again as in the legal case, leaves the elitism standing is that the community as a whole must include select individuals who perform inquiry. In effect, the theologian is doing the epistemic work for everyone else, just as we saw that there might need to be some mujtahids in law without every Muslim needing to perform ijtihad. The ideas I've just surveyed appear early in the history of Islamic theology and are echoed in the following centuries. Here my discussion will be necessarily even sketchier, but allow me to refer to just three later theologians who took strikingly critical positions towards Taqlīd. I first want to mention the Persian thinker al-Dawani, who talked about his own journey from Taqlīd to ijtihad. This is going to be a long passage, but it's brilliant, so it's worth it. Get comfortable. I said to myself, O soul, which has these beliefs, do you take them to be true and accurate on the basis of intellect or pure Taqlīd? The soul replied, even though they are Taqlīd, still they arise from something true and from the discernment of intellect. By way of proof, the soul added, when it comes to my beliefs, I am the muqallid of someone who is my mujtahid. Or actually, it's mujahid because it's Persian, but it's basically mujtahid. And all his beliefs are true since they arose through the discernment of intellect. Therefore, my beliefs are all true. Even though this proof has been constructed in a perfect arrangement, still when I placed the argument on the scales of intellect, it had no weight. So I debated with myself anew and asked my soul, what do you believe about the truth of the mujtahid? Could it be that there is an error among his beliefs or not? My soul chose the first option. So I said to it, on that assumption, the major premise of the proof, which you built to prove your beliefs, is false. For whoever errs cannot be given confidence, such that all his beliefs are certain to be true and accurate. And this argument has as its conclusion that not all the beliefs of the muqallid are true. Furthermore, if the aforementioned assumption of the proof were true, then it would follow that the beliefs of the muqallid of every religion and creed would be true by the same reasoning, and then the soul could not respond. Notice that he here invokes the consideration I just mentioned, that Taqlīd exposes believers to epistemic luck. If you are not yourself engaging in ijtihad, you just have to hope that the sources of your Taqlīd beliefs knew what they were doing. This is vividly supplemented by the final point that adherents of religions other than Islam could happily retain their false beliefs by depending on Taqlīd with no less justification than the Muslim Muqallid. And as you're going to see, that's going to be a point that runs through especially tomorrow's lecture. Around the same time, in the Islamic West, in the Maghreb, we found the Moroccan scholar Muhammad ibn Yusuf as-Sanusi taking an even stronger line against Taqlīd. He lays down a blanket ban against it, even for ordinary believers. This universalist view has been discussed in a recent book by Khaled al-Ruayheb, who explains that for as-Sanusi, every Muslim must master the basics of Asharite theology. This is sort of like all Notre Dame students having to take theology and philosophy classes, right? But for everybody. Everyone has the responsibility to engage in inquiry so as to reach certainty, and those who don't do this are unbelievers. When as-Sanusi demands certainty, he's asking for more than the subjective feeling of confidence that al-Juwayni had in mind, which could give the ordinary believer knowledge in an extended sense. As I've pointed out elsewhere, theologians who allowed Taqlīd to the non-expert were depending not only on that feeling of certainty, but also on the tacit assumption that the non-expert Muslim has indeed gotten epistemically lucky. The sources of belief he happens to follow are indeed reliable, so his beliefs wind up being true. Ooh, that's not good. Let me see if I can get rid of that. Ha. Right, so as al-Dawani observed, had an ordinary Muslim been born a Christian or a Jew, he or she would have had false beliefs instead. You can see why that would not be enough for as-Sanusi. He wants believers to do more than feel confident in believing something that is, fortunately for them, in fact true. Believers must go through arguments that establish the truth of their beliefs. Their feeling of certainty must be earned and well justified. You may not have heard of as-Sanusi, but he was an extremely influential figure whose works were received, among other places, in sub-Saharan Africa. One short work of his is still taught in modern-day Nigeria, and in the centuries after his death, there were commentaries written on his works in Fulfide. To give you an idea of the esteem in which he was held, one story circulating about him had it that a member of his circle found himself unable to cook meat because mere acquaintance with as-Sanusi made fire ineffective, the point being that his associates were guaranteed to avoid burning in hell. His intellectual legacy included teachings on Taqlīd by African scholars, such as the 17th century Fulani theologian Muhammad al-Wali al-Maliki, based in what is now the country of Chad. Like as-Sanusi, he held that there is universal responsibility laid upon all Muslims to avoid Taqlīd and become acquainted with argumentative proofs for their beliefs about God. As Dorrit van Dalen has pointed out, this general demand was in a way an attempt to assert the standing and importance of the scholarly elite. Scholars should provide guidance to common believers by showing them, for instance, that the Quran contains proofs of God's existence and omnipotence. Van Dalen tells the story of a West African town called Siljil Masa, where ordinary citizens were quizzed to see whether they could answer philosophical questions about the oneness of God. In that sort of context, theologians would have as reliable a function in society as the driving instructors, without whose help you aren't going to get your license. And this is an important point. As was noted by early followers of Shafi'i, avoiding Taqlīd does not imply that you actually do everything on your own with no help. It's consistent with taking advice, what was in a legal context called consultation, mushawara. So long as the person who receives the advice understands the reasoning according to which the decision has been reached. So you can be taken through a proof, and if you understand it, that's enough to avoid Taqlīd. You don't have to think of the proof yourself, right? In this sense, even theologians who took the universalist view that all Muslims should ground their belief in rational understanding typically had a very elitist position. When the early Mu'tazilites, al-Ash'ari and his followers, as-Sanusi or Muhammad al-Wali, said that every believer should do a bit of theology, that is all they meant, a bit of theology, enough to give them a secure, well-justified confidence in the fundamentals of their religion. As expert theologians, these same figures would have seen themselves as occupying a much higher level of rational understanding. And that goes double for theologians who, in a more condescending fashion, advise that ordinary believers avoid independent inquiry entirely. One theologian who had this sort of view was the great Asharite theologian, philosopher, and mystic al-Ghazali, who is as close as this series of lectures has to a hero, as you'll be seeing. He was a student of al-Juwayni, who, to quote Richard Frank again, held that real knowledge is the property of a small elite who are capable on the basis of their own insight and ability of independently working out the rational demonstrations of the truth of their belief against any conceivable difficulty or counterargument. Along the same lines, al-Ghazali reserved inquiry for the few and prescribed pure taqlīd for the many. In yet another version of that hierarchy we saw in the context of Islamic jurisprudence, he distinguished between true scholars who have knowledge and genuine certainty, theologians who attain some rational understanding but still accept many things in religion on the basis of authority, and ordinary people who never get past taqlīd. He did concede that some few might rationally grasp the basic principles of Islam on the strength of convincing arguments found in the Quran, as already proposed by al-Ash'ari, but generally al-Ghazali thought it was not a good idea for most people to indulge in speculation. In fact, he wrote an entire work discouraging them from kalam, the pursuit of which would as likely lead them astray as bring them to better understanding. As Frank Griffel has written for al-Ghazali, in the case of the ordinary people, taqlīd is not only tolerated, but welcomed, since an acquaintance with independent thinking would run the risk of having this group of people fall into unbelief. In al-Ghazali's most famous work, The Incoherence of the Philosophers, Tahafut al-Falasifa, he aims the weapons of the taqlīd debate on an unexpected target, the falasifa, the Aristotelian Avant-Garde. These self-satisfied, self-styled philosophers claim to be outdoing the theologians in the use of reason, as we'll see in a moment. But for al-Ghazali, they were just engaging in taqlīd with different sources. Instead of blindly following a legal scholar, theologian, or even a prophet, they chose to follow Aristotle. Here we have an example of being epistemically unlucky in the way that ordinary Muslims have epistemic luck, insofar as their taqlīd leads them to embrace genuine truths unreflectively. Since philosophers accept whatever the Aristotelians say on the basis of their authority, they wind up embracing falsehoods instead. In particular, they come to hold three beliefs that qualify as outright unbelief: that the universe is eternal, that God knows particulars and not universals, knows universals and not particulars, and that the afterlife is purely immaterial with no resurrection of the body. This is the charge sheet laid against the falasifa in al-Ghazali's Incoherence. Actually, only the first of these three teachings, the eternity of the universe, is explicitly present in Aristotle. The second one, about God's knowledge, is distinctive of Avicenna, though based on Aristotelian premises. The third can also be ascribed to Avicenna, but is really a more general Platonic commitment, pervasive in philosophy starting with late antiquity. But no matter, al-Ghazali's point and his accusation is that the falasifa cannot prove these things. How could they, since they're false? So they've been led to believe them through taqlīd rather than a reliable reasoning process. Anticipating al-Dawani's point that taqlīd can explain the religious beliefs of non-Muslims, al-Ghazali even compares the philosophers' convictions to the way that Jews and Christians accept the religious faith of their parents. If al-Ghazali is the most famous critic of the falasifa, then Averroes would be the most famous critic of al-Ghazali. In several works, including his pointedly titled Incoherence of the Incoherence, as well as his decisive treatise, Fasl al-Maqal, he rebuts al-Ghazali and along the way asserts an epistemic hierarchy that mirrors and seeks to replace the hierarchies we've seen in Muslim jurists and theologians. In doing so, he's taking up an earlier rationalist theory of philosophical supremacy offered a couple of centuries earlier by al-Farabi. As explained in a recent study by Fariel Bouhafa, al-Farabi's Book of Religion argues that Islamic law is subordinated to philosophy, in particular to ethics. As Bouhafa puts it, al-Farabi requires merely that the jurist hold correct beliefs and possess the virtues of his religion. The jurist's role is to accept the judgments laid down by the religion's founder and his successors, if any. In the case of Islam, these would be the Prophet Muhammad and the four rightly guided caliphs. And then to apply these judgments to new or unclear cases, thus dealing with particulars rather than reaching universal determinations about human conduct. Similarly, the theologian is someone who deals with theoretical issues at the level of mere beliefs, without having true understanding. In both the practical and theoretical spheres, such understanding is reserved for philosophy, which provides knowledge at the level of necessary and universal proof, which is dignified with the level of demonstration, burhan. Al-Farabi thus states that all the excellent laws fall under the universals of practical philosophy, while the theoretical beliefs in the religion have their demonstrations in theoretical philosophy. Al-Farabi assumes that very few people will be in a position to understand these issues at a philosophical, that is, demonstrative level. So most adherents to a religion will have to embrace it at the level of mere belief, just like the jurists and theologians. Al-Farabi introduces an influential way of thinking about this contrast, derived from the Aristotelian logical tradition. If philosophers grasp things at the level of demonstration, then everyone else grasps them at the level of dialectic and rhetoric. To put it another way, whereas philosophers are in possession of proofs constructed in accordance with the strictures laid down in Aristotle's posterior analytics, normal people hold their religious convictions having been persuaded by the sort of discourse analyzed in Aristotle's Topics and Rhetoric. As Al-Farabi puts it, dialectic provides strongly held opinion concerning the things for which demonstration provides certainty, or most of them. Rhetoric persuades about most of the things that are not such as to be demonstrated or the subject of dialectical inquiry. The excellent religion does not then belong only to philosophers or to those who are in a position to understand things that are only discussed in a philosophical way. Rather, most of those who are taught and instructed in the beliefs of the religion and accept its prescribed actions are not in that position, whether this is by nature or because they are too busy for it. These people are not unable to understand commonly accepted or merely persuasive things. Here, the word commonly accepted, the Arabic is mashhur, is a technical term corresponding to the Greek endoxon. Endoxic propositions are those that are acceptable for use in dialectical arguments, as explained in Aristotle's Topics. They are acceptable because they are held by just about everybody, or by those reputed for wisdom. Only when we seek demonstration do we insist on premises that are in fact and without doubt true, instead of settling for these commonly accepted premises. So for Al-Farabi, ordinary believers do not have certain knowledge, but this is all right, so long as they have epistemic luck. If the beliefs they accept through persuasion or acceptance of commonly held views are those of an excellent religion, they will have good opinions and will perform good actions. The label of ignorance is thus reserved for those unlucky enough to adhere to a wicked religion. The same idea is expressed in the title of one of Al-Farabi's better-known works, which sets out a philosophical cosmology, anthropology, and political philosophy under the heading Principles of the Beliefs of the Inhabitants of the Excellent City. In other words, philosophy offers the true demonstrative basis for things that members of a successful religious and political community believe without proof. It should, I think, be obvious how close this whole line of thought is to the ideas about taqlīd and ijtihad we found among jurists and theologians. For Al-Farabi, the equivalent of the mujtahid, who thinks for himself and can give good reason for his judgments, is the philosopher who has grasped true conclusions by means of demonstrative arguments. Everyone else is engaged in some form of taqlīd, following commonly accepted ideas, or at best engaging in some kind of merely dialectical inquiry on the grounds of religious beliefs that are taken for granted. This would be the status of theologians, for instance. The only distinctively religious figures not subject to taqlīd are the original lawgiver or prophet and his successors. But they are the exception that proves the rule, because they too have understanding at a philosophical level. In the case of the prophet, perfect intellectual understanding is fused with a capacity to represent philosophical truths in a rhetorically persuasive way that will successfully induce taqlīd in his religious followers, this being the function of revelation. And basically, Muhammad for Al-Farabi is Aristotle, but with a book that can convince people that he's right. Al-Farabi thus accepts wholesale the epistemic hierarchy of the elite Islamic scholars, albeit with new labels drawn from the Aristotelian tradition. But he denies that the scholars of Islamic law and theology are the true elite who are capable of engaging in independent reasoning. That status is reserved for people like him, the falasifa. For a more elaborate statement of this philosophical version of epistemic elitism, we can turn to Averroes. As a practicing Muslim jurist, he was certainly well acquainted with ideas about ijtihad and taqlīd. In fact, his own grandfather, who was also named Ibn Rushd, explicitly set down a hierarchy of scholars within the Maliki legal school in three groups. First, those who practiced taqlīd of Malik, the school founder, and his followers, by just memorizing and repeating their opinions. Second, those who accept Malik's authority and can determine what is consistent with the school's teachings, but still cannot issue rulings on novel cases. This corresponds to what we already saw under the heading of ijtihad within a school, or affiliated ijtihad. Third, the elite who understand legal methods and can issue novel opinions. So this is the pure mujtahid. In a legal treatise of his own, the famous Decisive Treatise, Averroes took up the question of the status of philosophy in Islam. He boldly argues that philosophy is not just permitted, but actually obligatory for those who are in a position to pursue it, those who are not, in Al-Farabi's words, prevented by nature or because they are too busy for it. With equal boldness, he goes on to contend that it is philosophers who are in the best position to understand the true meaning of the Quranic revelation. They alone have independent access to the truth through demonstrative reasoning. Since the Quran is true, and truth does not contradict truth, famous slogan, their demonstrated conclusions can be used as a kind of check or constraint on possible interpretations of Scripture. These aspects of the Decisive Treatise are well known. Less commonly discussed is the parallel Averroes draws between law and philosophy. He is here a jurist writing for other jurists, so it makes sense for him to argue along the following lines. If the study of jurisprudence is licit or even encouraged within Islam, then philosophy is as well. For example, one cannot argue against philosophical activity on the grounds that it is an innovation, because the Prophet's immediate followers did not pursue it. After all, those early followers did not do jurisprudence either, and no one infers from this that jurists are doing anything un-Islamic. Indeed, the scriptural support for studying the law would provide even stronger support for studying philosophy. So he says, when the jurist deduces from God's statement, may he be exalted, reflect, you have vision, the obligation to know juridical argument, how much more worthy and appropriate is it for someone who understands God to deduce from this verse the obligation to know intellectual argument? In other words, the philosopher can use the same verse that the jurist uses. Among these parallels between law and philosophy, the most important for our purposes is that the philosopher is, like the independently minded jurist, entitled to engage in independent reflection. Averroes cites a famous hadith, often brandished by defenders of legal ijtihad, to the effect that the jurist who engages in ijtihad and reaches an independent judgment is rewarded twice if the judgment is correct, and once if he gets it wrong. Averroes then adds, but which judge is greater than the one who makes judgments about being, this being the philosopher? Following the lead of Al-Farabi, Averroes sets up an Aristotelian version of the legal hierarchy recognized by his own grandfather and other jurists. At the top are those who engage in demonstration, the philosophers. Then those of the dialectical class, who work with non-demonstrative arguments, that's the theologians. And finally, ordinary people who just believe by being persuaded through a combination of rhetoric and dialectic. These people simply believe what they are told, either because it has been put to them in a powerfully convincing way, here Averroes has in mind the rhetorical power of rhetoric, or because it is commonly accepted, again that Aristotelian technical notion. A commonly accepted proposition, as we've seen, is one that everyone espouses or one taught by reputable scholars. So as Averroes explains in his paraphrased commentary of Aristotle's Topics, this is Aristotle's work on dialectic, the dialectical premise is an accepted statement. It may be accepted by all, for instance, the statement that God exists, or accepted by most people without being rejected by the rest, or accepted by the scholars and the philosophers without being rejected by the masses. What of the dialectical middle class, the class between ordinary folk who simply accept things by taqlīd, and the philosophers who engage in ijtihad and are satisfied only by demonstration? So standardly, one is told that for Averroes, the dialecticians are the mutakallimun, the practitioners of theology, like I just said. And he does say in a closely related work, which is called, this is a bit of a mouthful, The Exposition of the Methods Used in Arguments Concerning Religious Doctrines, that the most adequate rank of the art of kalam is dialectical and not demonstrative wisdom. But in fact, he tends to think that the theologians of his own culture, like Al-Ghazali and other Ash'arites, are failed dialecticians. So they're not merely failing to be philosophers, they're not even good dialecticians. This is because they do not argue as they should from commonly accepted premises, but instead proceed on the basis of highly controversial and abstruse assumptions when they do things like proving the existence of God. As a result, their arguments are, as Averroes says, fitting neither for the scholars nor for the many. There should in principle be theologians who carry out useful tasks like defending the faith using non-demonstrative arguments, but Averroes sees his own society as unfortunately including only two kinds of people who behave as they should: the ordinary person who takes everything on trust, the muqallid, and the philosopher who is a kind of Aristotelian mujtahid. There's a lot we can learn from these debates, apart from the need to situate the teachings of the Falasifa within wider Islamic culture. And maybe I should dwell for just a second on the irony of this fact that this kind of hyper-rationalism that supposedly marks out the Islamic Falasifa as the most philosophical philosophers of the Middle Ages, they got their self-conception as rationalists by borrowing it from theologians and jurists. So that's kind of the polemical background of my paper. Okay, but apart from that, we can also see now how ambitious and even unrealistic it would be to have a blanket ban on Taqlīd. Averroes's frank elitism is, of course, rather unattractive. He envisions a tiny handful of knowledgeable experts surrounded by a huge mass of blind believers, a conception typical among the Falasifa and also finding many adherents among theologians and jurists. It may have seemed more plausible in a time when most people were not even literate, and when half the population, the female half, was in any case typically assumed to be incapable of serious scholarly reflection. Again, we'll get to that in the third lecture. Still, unattractive or not, the elitist position was not put forward without good reason. If the alternative to Taqlīd is to figure everything out for yourself, then how many people will be in a position to avoid Taqlīd? You might be an expert in particle physics, economics, the plays of Shakespeare, or the history of philosophy, but you're unlikely to have expertise in all four. In fact, you're unlikely to have expertise just in the history of philosophy, as I am discovering to my costs on a weekly basis. Even if you had expertise in all four of these fields, there'd still be plenty of other fields where you would lack even rudimentary understanding. We might therefore propose that ijtihad should be limited to only the most important issues, or that as a community we should engage in division of labor. Again, the Islamic juridical tradition anticipated both moves. The universalists we discussed, who spoke out against Taqlīd, wanted all believers to understand a few central religious topics, not particle physics or Shakespeare. When it came to more advanced legal reasoning, it was also admitted that a jurist might be an expert mujtahid in one area of the law, but an obedient muqallid in another, just as nowadays divorce lawyers are not usually criminal attorneys as well. But there are aspects of the Islamic legal tradition that should make us wary of even localized ijtihad, this kind of labor sharing. A point forcefully put by defenders of legal precedent was that individual judgment, even when practiced by trained experts, is liable to go astray. A much discussed example was the case of arriving in a city and wanting to know which direction to pray so as to face Mecca. Would it really make sense to work this out for oneself rather than just adopting the local practice followed by thousands of people? As one jurist put it, it is extremely unlikely that they could have made a mistake that could be rectified by the reasoning of a single person. And indeed, the perils of ijtihad are plain to see. In the Islamic tradition, it has often been fundamentalists who adopted a universalist posture and polemicized against Taqlīd. Proceeding from the plausible assumption that individual believers are responsible for their own piety, these fundamentalists have rejected the edifice of legal and religious learning in favor of returning to a direct engagement with the revelation and evidence about the Prophet and earliest generations of Muslims. So you know the word Salafi, that's what it means, following the Salaf. The Salaf are the original generations of early Muslims. So they're saying, to avoid Taqlīd, we abandon the entire tradition and go back to the start. Epistemically speaking, this is the equivalent of political movements in the United States and Europe that encourage their followers to abandon traditional news sources, academic opinion, and the like. The more sweeping the rejection of Taqlīd, the worse the results. It's what Sandy Hook conspiracy theorists like Alex Jones have in common with Salafi jihadists. A comparison he probably would not like, but which is true. By the way, I always like to know if the speaker is almost done, and the speaker is almost done. Last paragraph. A more refined approach to the problem of Taqlīd would not require being a mujtahid for each and every topic we care about, or if this is too difficult, instead blindly following the nearest authority at hand, thus surrendering to the vagaries of epistemic luck. What we need is a better account of how to form one's own views while realizing that one is dependent on the expertise and authority of other people. As the historian Mary Beard recently observed, the recognition of complexity and difficulty is not an admission of defeat, it is treating a complex problem with the respect it deserves. Doing this well means depending on authority in an intelligent and discerning way, which is a big part of being a responsible believer and a responsible citizen. I won't be able to offer you a full account along these lines in these lectures this week, but I think I can show you that the medieval philosophical tradition has valuable resources that could point us in the right direction, but to find out why, you will have to come tomorrow. So I take my own questions? Carl. Yes.
There's a structural possibility I want to mention because there's these three different groups of people. There's the local masses, and then there's the specialists in the masses, and then there's the philosophers. Now, actually, how does enlightenment say? Sort of exactly these questions. Often this Aristotelian say. Distinguishes the fields of, they correspond to the European university faculties, the fields of law, the fields of medicine, theology. There's a grad bracket that really includes law, politics, and military. Okay. And what he says is, of course, in order to relate to life, you got to listen to the specialists, so they just accept advice. But what he also says is, if you forget this, is, and this is the new structural hypothesis that you guys thought of. Coming from Rousseau, he says that these specialist fields all involve kind of local and contingent matters. Things change in theology, things change in health, things changing in medicine. And nobody can study all this stuff, so you just got to go along with what we're doing. But he also says that there's a group of fundamental truths that we all know in our heart, the moral law, and the common person has this, and the philosophers have the philosophers have that. And basically they totally agree, so the philosophers might be agreed. So the job of the philosopher is just to knock down the pretensions of the specialists when within theology, or law or medicine, they say, well, this is, absolutely governs everything. Of course, today we're run by the absolutization of medicine and natural science. Anyway, but the idea is an alliance of the masses of the philosopher, because the masses don't have to be thought of as just blind believers, or whatever. They can be thought of as having this little thing within them, common sense or healthy understanding, or proper, faith, etc.
Yeah, that's okay. So that's in the essay on enlightenment. That's the essay on enlightenments that you're quoting from there. Yeah. Okay. That's really interesting. Okay. So two things. First of all, there's a hadith of the Prophet, which I'm actually quoting in tomorrow night's lecture, but sneak preview, that everyone is born a Muslim, and their parents make them a Jew or a Christian or a Zoroastrian. So that idea that everyone kind of comes into the world ready to get things right, and then they're corrupted, is certainly a thought that you find in Islam, and is maybe one reason to think that, this again is getting into the themes of tomorrow night's lecture, but there's a question about if you weren't just going to do what your parents said, what should you do instead? And one idea is that your natural gifts might point you in the right direction, so it's kind of an epistemic optimism, which in a way is clearly very much at odds with the epistemic elitism, where 0.1% of the population are getting it right and everyone else has to engage in Taqlīd, right? And in fact, this is exactly the sort of thing that the universalist camp would point to when they say, well, no, everyone can, at least for the important things, everyone can do ijtihad, right? Everyone can at least understand some proofs. Everyone's kind of comes with enough equipment, right? So that idea is certainly there. You don't find that idea expressed very much by philosophers, but they say something else which resonates with your Kant passage, which is that, so when they say the philosopher is the one who demonstrates truth, they obviously don't mean the philosopher demonstrates that there are 5 chairs here, right? And in fact, they don't mean that the philosopher demonstrates anything particular at all, because they're basing themselves on the posterior analytics. And in the posterior analytics, Aristotle says that knowledge in the strict and proper sense, episteme, comes from demonstrations. So, and there are various criteria that need to be satisfied for a proof to be demonstrative, like the premises have to be true, the argument has to be sound or valid, so true, that gives you soundness. But in addition to that, some surprising things, for example, the premises have to be necessarily true to exclude possibility of error, and they have to be universal in character. So that means that when Averroes, he wouldn't mind me confusing them, but when Averroes says that the philosopher has demonstration of the truth, what he means is universal necessary truths, not particulars. So insofar as Kant is saying, well, this kind of expert knowledge where you believe what people say, that's really only for contingent particular matters, Averroes could probably agree with that. But of course, that's not what they're arguing about. They're arguing about things like, can we show that God exists? And that's actually a strange example because God is a particular, but for him that would fall under metaphysics because God is the source of being and that's a universal claim. Okay, yes.
Thank you so much, Bernard. So I have a question about the Shia Islam.
Yeah.
I was wondering what was the historical development behind Shia jurists actually prohibiting Taqlīd theology. Mm-hmm. What happened that it became such a phenomenon that you cannot do Taqlīd theology? Taqlīd is just for theft.
Yeah, right. So again, I actually will talk a little bit about this tomorrow night because I'll mention Ghazali's attack on Shi'ism. So a standard thing that happens is that the Sunni theologians say, oh, you Shi'is, you're pervasively prey to Taqlīd because you just follow your imams. So we're the rationalists, you're not, right? And so I think that the Shi'is were under pressure in this sort of dialectical situation to insist that there was a way of being a Shi'i jurist and theologian as well without falling into outright Taqlīd. And to be honest, I think that what they're saying, they would probably disagree with this, but I think what they're saying effectively amounts to, let's see if I get back to this, so the middle level, namely ijtihad within a school, because you can conceptualize, for example, Ismailism, there's a branch of Shi'ism, as a school, or Shi'i jurisprudence as a school within Islam. Now, of course, what they would say is, no, Shiite Islam is Islam, so that's not a constraint, because the imams are the only ones who can tell us what the Quran means, right? But I think they're inevitably committed to a form of authoritative belief formation that the Sunnis are not necessarily committed to. Some Sunnis are committed to it anyway because they say, well, you should show Taqlīd to the prophet. So they wouldn't drive ijtihad that far, that you should avoid Taqlīd even with respect to the prophet, but some would. Some would say, as we'll see tomorrow night, some would say, no, you use reason even when you're trying to understand why you're a Muslim in the first place. And I think it's a very difficult thing for a Shiite to say. Yeah. I sure have. Oh, that's an interesting question. Okay, so the Brethren of Purity, Ikhwana Safa. Yeah, so she's asking about the Brethren of Purity, who are a rather mysterious group of scholars from the 10th century in Iraq, probably. So they're called Ikhwana Safa in Arabic. We don't actually know for sure who they were. There's different stories about this, and they wrote a set of epistles which kind of, in an encyclopedic fashion, goes through all the departments of Aristotelian and Platonist philosophy. So now they are hardcore Platonists, or even Neoplatonists, and they therefore think that knowledge comes through contact with like a celestial intellect, which has a double role, both forming the cosmos and also bestowing knowledge on a suitably prepared human mind. You get similar ideas in Farabi. You also get similar ideas this actually connects to your question because you get similar ideas also in Ismaili Shiism, and some people think that there's a strong connection between Ismailism and the Brethren of Purity for this kind of reason. So the real question for the Ikhwan, I guess, would be, who is it that's able to do that? So is it only like the Prophet and the Imam who's able to do it, or is it the philosopher as well? And here we start getting into the weeds of the Ikhwan's doctrinal sectarian commitments. I tend to think that they probably would allow the pure rational philosopher to unite to the intellect, in which case that's their version of ijtihad, right? And then if you don't do that, you probably need to engage in some form of taqlīd. Actually, maybe here it's a good point to admit that at no point did I say almost anything about how ijtihad works. So once you've accepted that humans should at least sometimes engage in ijtihad, okay, now you owe us an epistemology. So you're going to sit down and come to knowledge on the basis of pure reason. How will you do that? Well, maybe you have first principles, like axioms. Maybe you use experience and derive them empirically. Maybe you unite to a celestial intellect. Maybe you do all three of those things, then you're Avicenna, right? But there's certainly a big story to be filled in here, but I think they would probably be basically with the philosophers on this.
Yeah. Thanks. So first, this was a really great lecture.
Thank you.
I'm wondering about the more modest version of the universalists. Mm-hmm. And so the puzzle is, whose job is it to decide which small cluster of demonstrations we need? Mm-hmm. And does answering that question present a new sort of pushback problem of Taqlīd, or is that actually easy?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, one way of thinking about this might be that what is it to be a Muslim? Well, it's to believe that there is no God but God and Muhammad is his prophet. And so if you can get there using ijtihad, you might be done, because now you're a Muslim. Yeah. Correct, yeah. But now we have to look at the fine print. Because the standard kalam proof for the existence of God is, and actually this might be worth going through this briefly, just to give you a sense of what these people were being asked to do in rural Africa when they were told that they had to do sort of theology 101 if they wanted to call themselves Muslims. Okay, so what is a created object? A created object is a substance, which is atomic in character, which has accidents. And the accidents change. In fact, they are instantaneous. They come into being and they go out of being. Things like motion and rest are examples. So if something is at rest, like this lectern, I know the lectern is actually hurtling through space at an unbelievable speed and rotating with the Earth. But okay, let's say it's at rest. It's an Aristotelian cosmos. It's at rest. So even the accident of rest is vanishing and being replaced by another accident of rest at each instant. Okay. Now here's the argument. Since the substance, and all bodies are substances, since the substance can't exist without the accident, and the accident comes into being, therefore the substance must come into being as well. And the world is a substance, or made of substances, therefore the world comes into being, therefore it was created, therefore God exists. I leave it for you to decide if that's a good argument. Philosophers tended to think it wasn't. And this is what Averroes means when he says they appeal to abstruse premises, like this distinction between substance and accident. This is not a commonly accepted view, right? This is their specialist physics, which isn't even true, actually. And it certainly isn't kind of intuitive. But the reason I go through it is to point out that they would prove God, and on the way they would need the premise that the world was not eternal. So this is actually one of the things, as probably a lot of you know, that the debate over the world's eternity is a kind of a big running problem in Islamic theology, and it became a big running problem in Latin medieval philosophy in part because of that. And something that I've often wondered is why, because you might think, well, I'm God. Let's just say I'm God. It's a little bit presumptuous, but it's just a thought experiment. So I'm God, and I can do anything. So presumably, it could be that there's an eternal world, but also I could create a non-eternal world. I could just decide, right? So actually, it looks like unless you can prove that it's impossible that the world is eternal, or prove that it's impossible that the world comes into being with a first moment in time, it should be that philosophy can't tell you the answer, right? Which is, of course, exactly what Aquinas, Maimonides, and others say. But and so you might wonder, given that all these people believe in divine omnipotence, why are they so worried? And one of the reasons that they're worried is that their proof for God's existence in the first place turns on denying the eternity of the world. So they think that if you accept an eternal world, you're actually one step, maybe not one step towards atheism, but you're depriving yourself of their favorite proof. Another reason would be the fear that if the world is eternal, then the world is necessarily existent. And if it's necessarily existent, then God had no choice about making it. So there's a couple of reasons why they're so hot and bothered about this, but this is one of them, that this is the famous Kalam proof. Yeah?
I'm wondering about the attitude of philosophers like Averroes and Avicenna towards the Quran. So given that they took Aristotle as dogma, what would happen if the Quran came into conflict with Aristotle? Would they believe that they still owed like a blind following towards the Quran?
Yeah, that's a great question. So just in case not everyone heard that, so the question is, what do the philosophers do if it looks like there's a conflict between Aristotle and the Quran? So basically, who wins if things go bad, right? So the answer that Averroes is by far the one who gives the most explicit answer to this question. So this goes back to that motto, truth does not contradict truth. So for him, it's just taken as granted that the Quran is true. What's not so clear is what the Quran means. So he says that, following a traditional idea about the Quran, that there are different kinds of verses in the Quran. Some are clearly just straightforwardly to be applied, like pay a certain tax in this certain situation, right? That's not something you have to interpret allegorically. Then there are some passages which have to be taken allegorically, and then there are some where it's not clear whether to take them allegorically or not. So for any passage other than those that are obviously to be taken in the superficial meaning, there's a question of interpretation. And when questions of interpretation arise, what you need is a way of constraining the field of possible interpretations, and he suggests constraining the field by using the assumption that whatever the correct interpretation is, it will make the Quran come out saying something true. So all you need to do is find out the truth and then check your interpretation against that. So in a way, by definition, philosophy can't conflict with the Quran because philosophy is telling you what the Quran means. Another way, what he says is truth does not contradict truth, right? The Quran is true, philosophy is true, so they can't contradict. Now, behind your question might be the of course unjustified fear that Aristotle ever said anything untrue. So the first thing Averroes would say is, you clearly don't understand Aristotle if you're worried about that. The second thing he would say is he could retrench to a more reasonable position where he says, well, when I say philosophical demonstration, I mean successful philosophical demonstration. It so happens that Aristotle is the person who's lived on Earth who's come closest to doing that all the time and most successfully. He even says that. He says that Aristotle's the most full realization of the human species that has yet been born. Not in quite those words, but he says something like that in one of his commentaries. But in the unfortunate eventuality that Aristotle makes a mistake, that would just show that he wasn't being a philosopher when he did that. So a philosopher, in the strict and proper sense, takes philosopher to be a success term. So it means that you're demonstrating. And demonstrations, like valid, sound demonstrations, they prove something true in a demonstrative way, so obviously they can't be wrong. But the interesting thing here is that you don't correct or reinterpret the deliverances of philosophy using the Quran and the Hadith, rather the other way around. So if there's an apparent tension, what has to give is your incorrect interpretation of Scripture, not your correct philosophical demonstration. Yeah?
Supposing I'm a Salafi, and I want to ask about where I learn how to reason.
Yeah.
So wouldn't my sort of make a critique saying something along the lines of, but hang on, the tradition has learned that this is how to reason from the Greeks,
Yeah.
when really I should be learning this is how to reason from the habits of the from the Greeks in the Quran itself.
Yeah.
Well, what's the kind of response of those who defend some Taqlīd to that?
So the philosopher would have sort of say, well, if they got it from the Greeks, then good, because the Greek epistemology is the correct one. The mutakallimun will say, well, hang on a second, our epistemology is not from the Greeks, it's already from the Quran, right? So for example, so remember there was this line from al-Ash'ari about the Quran including proofs and demonstrations of the truth, right? So the Quran, they would say, models for you the right way to reason about God, as well as telling you the truth about God. So actually, an example would be that proof we just went through. So they would say, when it says that God unfurled the mountains like a carpet or whatever, basically that's the point, right? So his omnipotent, all these passages about his omnipotent power, everything kind of depends on him from moment to moment, this kind of line in the Quran, for them that's just that first premise, that accidents come into being and pass away and are therefore dependent on a creator. So they would reject very strongly the claim that their epistemology is in any way un-Islamic. They would say it's directly taken from the Islamic sources along with the proof itself. But I mean, of course that's not true in some sense. I mean, the Quran, I would say, underdetermines it doesn't answer the question directly of which philosophical method we should use when we reason, but they could maybe more plausibly at least say that their way of reasoning was consistent with patterns of thought you find in the Quran or something. Like I said before, the question of which is the correct method to use to arrive at knowledge is a big, empty piece of paper that needs to be filled in, but I will say something about that tomorrow. So, join me.
Thank you very much, and I want to remind you that Peter will be lecturing again tomorrow, this time downstairs, right, in the hospitality room in this building, at the same time, 5 o'clock. His title will be Testing the Prophets, Reason and Medieval Religious Debate, so we have that to look forward to. In the meantime, please join me in thanking you.
Thank you.